I think at the end of the day, we can find common ground. I really do.
U.S. Republican House Speaker Kevin McCarthy and President Joe Biden held initial talks on Wednesday about raising the U.S. debt ceiling. This is the first test on how the two will work together. Both sides have agreed to talk more. And after a more than hour-long meeting, McCarthy said the two men could find common ground.
I shared my perspective with him. He shared his. And we agreed to continue the conversation. We want to make sure we do this in a responsible, reasonable way. And we'll be talking again.
No sign of an immediate breakthrough, though, as expected. After the meeting, the White House said Biden told McCarthy he was eager to work with Republicans in good faith. Biden has said Tuesday he wanted to see McCarthy's budget plan.
Show me his budget.
Republicans won control of the U.S. House of Representatives in November's midterm elections. Since then, the Democratic president has been locked in a standoff with the GOP over raising the federal government's $31.4 trillion U.S. debt ceiling. Failing to do so would put the world's largest economy on a path to default. Unlike most other developed countries, the United States puts a hard limit on how much it can borrow, and Congress must periodically raise that cap because the U.S. government spends more than it takes in. Shortly before the White House meeting, Fed Chair Jerome Powell warned of the risks if the cap is not raised.
I feel like I have to say this. There's only one way forward here, and that is for Congress to raise the debt ceiling so that the United States government can pay all of its obligations when due.
The White House said Biden was open to talks about deficit reduction, but untethered to the debt ceiling debate. House Republicans want to use the debt ceiling as leverage to exact cuts, though they have yet to unite around a specific plan.
At today's meeting, the committee raised the target range for the federal funds rate by 25 basis points.
The Federal Reserve on Wednesday announced its latest interest rate hike, but the smallest one since it began to aggressively raise borrowing costs to curb rampant inflation. Wednesday's quarter-point increase comes after a half-point hike in December and a three-quarter-point increase the month before that. And it came with the forecast that the Fed isn't finished.
We will need substantially more evidence to be confident that inflation is on a sustained downward path.
At a press conference, Fed Chair Jerome Powell noted positive signs that inflation was beginning to abate.
We can now say, I think, for the first time, that the disinflationary process has started. We can see that, and we see it really in goods prices so far.
But said it was insufficient to signal an end to the rate hikes, though it would be stepping down from last year's rapid pace of increases. A statement released earlier Wednesday indicated that future rate increases would be in quarter percentage point increments.
We will continue to make our decisions meeting by meeting, taking into account the totality of incoming data and their implications for the outlook for economic activity and inflation.
The decision lifted the benchmark overnight interest rate to a range between 4.50% and 4.75%, a move widely anticipated by investors and flagged by U.S. central bankers ahead of this week's two-day policy session. Inflation, based on the Fed's preferred measure, slowed to a 5% annual rate in December. The Fed hopes it can continue nudging inflation lower to its 2% target without triggering a deep recession or causing a substantial rise in the unemployment rate from the current 3.5%, a level rarely seen in recent decades.
This joint US-South Korea military drill has prompted a scathing attack from North Korea. After the B-1B heavy bombers and stealth fighters flew exercises, Pyongyang's foreign ministry said in state media Thursday that such drills had pushed the situation to an extreme red line. It also said that the North was not interested in dialogue as long as Washington pursues hostile policies. The White House has hit back at the accusation, saying that the US has no such intent towards North Korea. The spat comes hot off the heels of Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin's trip to Seoul, during which he vowed to expand military drills and deploy more strategic assets there, such as aircraft carriers and long-range bombers. North Korea's statement cited Austin's trip as a cause for concern, saying, quote, "This is a vivid expression of the US dangerous scenario, which will result in turning the Korean peninsula into a huge war arsenal and a more critical war zone." More than 28,500 American troops are based in South Korea as a legacy of the 1950 to 1953 Korean War, which ended in an armistice rather than a peace treaty. Last year, North Korea conducted a record number of ballistic missile tests. It was also observed reopening its shuttered nuclear weapons test site. This is what remains of the Colorado River. The vital body of water provides drinking water to 40 million people in 7 US states as part of a water distribution pact. But in the face of the worst drought in 12 centuries, made worse by climate change, the states had a January the 31st deadline to negotiate their own supply cuts or face possible mandatory cutbacks from the US government. As time was running out, Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming this week submitted a framework to cut water usage. But California wasn't part of it, having broken from the rest of the states to go it alone. Then California answered with its own counter-proposal, saying in a letter to federal officials that the plan from the other states directly and disproportionately impacts California. Some see California's decision to go it alone as increasing the odds the water fight will end up before the courts. David Hayes, a lecturer at Stanford University Law School, is a former top climate aide to President Joe Biden.
We have a situation where some of the water rights holders in California are saying we're not willing to give up more water, and we think we have legal rights, and we're willing to go to court if we have to. And that's not a solution here. And there's not enough time to litigate these issues. So much is at stake.
When the states struck their agreement 100 years ago, it presumed the river could provide much more water every year than it does now. That shortfall has left state water managers with more rights on paper than existing supply. California receives the largest allotment, most of it for Southern California. Statewide, 80% of California's water is consumed by its $50 billion agricultural industry. Despite the 30 inches of rain dumped over parts of California in recent weeks, little of that reached the Colorado River Basin.
Something is going to have to give.
Sharon Megdal is the director of the University of Arizona's Water Resources Research Center.
I think people would like to believe that we can somehow figure out a way to keep these economic activities, keep our kind of economies and livelihoods going, but it's going to be a drier future.
A report in the journal Nature last year found 2000 to 2021 to be the driest 22-year period for southwestern North America in at least 1,200 years. The recent storms dumped half an average year's rainfall on California in 3 weeks. But climate scientists expect such occasional deluges to be interspersed with long dry periods, all but ensuring that Western water wars will persist.
In a warehouse in Belgium sit rows and rows of Leopard tanks. Not the Leopard 2 model donated by Western governments to Ukraine. This is an older model, the Leopard 1. Freddy Vaslez wants to sell them, but does not like to be called an arms dealer. He is adamant, stressing to Reuters that he is the CEO of 2 defence companies that deal in a broad range of activities, such as making sensors for spacecraft. But buying and selling weapons is part of his business too.
Yes, we bought this approximately 8 years ago in the market. They are available over here, but we cannot use them as is, of course. We need a full retrofit. We have to look at the fire control system. So we really have to make them, bring them back to track before we can use them in any kind of battlefield.
It's these tanks that have brought him into the spotlight, as he is engaged in a public battle with the Belgian government over the possibility of sending them to Ukraine. While Ukraine's allies have pledged to send tanks to help Ukraine repel Russia's invasion, Belgium has not joined the group, for one reason above all. It doesn't have any tanks left. It sold the last 50 it had to Vaslez's company more than 5 years ago. And Belgian Defence Minister Ludovine de Donde is reluctant to buy them back.
These tanks were sold for a price of 10,000 to 15,000 euros each, as they were no longer working. Nothing prevents us from buying them back, but they are not operational.
And we're not going to buy them back at unreasonable prices either. And at the moment, there are Belgian companies that make a margin that is unreasonable.
Déraisonnable.
If Belgium does not buy back the tanks, Veslez says another country could purchase them for Kiev. Veslez said he had held discussions with several European governments about that option.
There are governments which we have, let's say, currently in discussion. I just got recently a call from the Ukraine government. So, there's a lot of interest, but that's because the German government gave export licenses, and until today that was not the case. But there's also the UK government, we're talking to the Swedish government, so there's a lot of governments interested, but we'll have to see what happens now.